Hello everyone, my name is Alex Isles, and in this week we've got something a bit different. So on this channel I usually focus on early medieval, Iron Age and Northern Britain, specifically in the northeast of England where I'm based and where I run my tours from. But this week we're working with another channel who's based down on the south coast, and so it's going to be a guest episode from Archaic Collective, who's actually a good friend on our channel, and alongside this as well, if you've ever been a part of my community posts or anything like that, you'll see that I share their videos, especially their recent series on hill forts. And if you love hill forts like I do, I can't suggest enough that you go across and have a look at those after you've watched this.
This is the small Sussex town of Bosham, though some sat-navs do still insist on calling it Bosham. It's a charming, if small, village perched on the coast. It doesn't have a beach, rather a flat, tidal inland marsh which floods these roads at high tide, every so often catching out motorists who decided this was a good parking spot. It has some charming houses, a couple of coffee shops, a train station that's a half-hour's walk away, which almost no one ever uses. All in all, it doesn't sound very promising as a place of historical significance, but that is where you may be in for a bit of a surprise.
Now, while Alex is a long-time tour guide and very accustomed to presenting to camera, I less frequently do stuff on location. I normally take the coward's way out and do it in the voiceover booth. But since I figure most of you don't know who I am, I wanted to pop into frame and say hi. Anyway, back to Bosham.
Not only does this place have the distinction of appearing on the Bayeux tapestry, but it may have played a decisive role in the Roman conquest of Britain. Your first clue as to the history of the town is the unmissable profile of the church. You can see this from afar as you pass on the road or the train to the north. If we unpack what we're seeing here, the tower is one of the oldest parts of the church. You can make out that it's roughly divided into 4 segments, not including the spire. A survey from 2004 dated the first 2 segments to somewhere between the end of the 900s, beginning of the 1000s. The third segment was slightly later, but still pre-conquest. That's pre-1066. I'm fairly sure the average Alex Isles audience member already knows what pre-conquest means, but just to keep everyone caught up. The fourth and final segment is early Norman, sometime between 1080 to 1110. If you're wondering what this coating is, the tower was covered in render in 1913, but this was removed from the stonework on the lowest 2 levels in 1933. The top 2 levels were re-rendered in 1989, both to repair the 1913 job, but even though this meant continuing to cover the historic stonework, it kind of needs protecting from the salty coastal winds. Speaking of stonework, coining is a bit of an obscure area of interest, so I guess it's going to depend how far down the church crawling rabbit hole some of you may or may not be. Simply put, it describes the stonework on the angle of a building, and as different engineers went about this in different ways, it helps us date buildings, particularly Saxon churches. When you get used to spotting it, the coining can be a good tell of a pre-conquest church. In the case of Bosham, it exhibits a particular school of coining known as the Sussex variation. What is sometimes described as long and short work, which, there you go, long and short. Well, in the Sussex variation, there can be a horizontal long as well as the vertical long. It's not entirely uniform. If you're not quite clear on it, get this book by Guy Points. It's pretty much the Bible on Saxon church features. We could also spend a while talking about the typology of windows, but we're at risk of getting too granular too soon. This upper window here is some of the main early Norman work surviving, and while there's a grab bag of pre-conquest openings on the towers, some blocked, some updated, there's also a great example of a triangular window on the inside wall of the tower. That's a pretty definitive Saxon hallmark. There's a finite number of those in England. While we're inside, the work here is a mix. I won't take the time to explain the cut-off between Romanesque and Gothic, but any time you see Gothic windows on a church, pretty clear cut that that's after the 1140s, and likewise Romanesque, aka rounded work, is tailing off from that point. So a few of the most ancient highlights to look out for. The first third of the chancel is also considered to be pre-conquest in date. There is a piscina from the 1100s on the wall to the left, which would have marked where the altar was at that time. The south wall of the chancel has courses of what's known as herringbone masonry. These are diagonal stones here which are characteristic of early Norman architecture. The font is late 1100s. The chancel arch is pretty huge and very attractive. It's dated to around 1080 to 1090 in the guide, though I've heard suggestions tossed around that it's pre-conquest. By the way, this process was made so much easier by this guide. I mean, I have a shelf full of church guides. They're a good start for investigating the history, and you can't just assume that this information is online somewhere. It frequently isn't. Well, some of them are just photocopied pages with a staple at the centre, but this has full citations and cites particular surveys that have been conducted. I mean, massive big ups to Joan Langhorne, who wrote and compiled all this. The bases of the columns are pretty striking. There's quite a number of features around the church that you look at. I mean, I never just go with my gut on this. I always want to see research from people who know what they're doing. But when you look at a bunch of features, it's striking. Like, that looks pretty Roman. Now, that's not an unreasonable line of inquiry. Some historical investigations of the church suggested it may have been built in the footprint of a Roman basilica. More on that later. There is some reused masonry visible in the walls outside. As to the capitals and bases, yes, they appear to have been moved here from another context. This was being discussed as recently as 2023, and it was suggested that more investigation was needed. But looking up, the work there has been dated pretty conclusively as Romanesque of 1070 onwards, and what ties it together with the dating of the chancel arch is the use of core stone. These are some of the remains of Quor Abbey on the Isle of Wight, near where the quarry for this stone is located. Just one more feature, and as is usually the way with the more pointy bits on church, the spire is later, although it's still pretty old. A 1998 study of the spire using dendrochronology determined that the wood for the spire was cut in the winter of 1405 to 06 and the summer of 1406, and since it wasn't seasoned, that is almost certainly the time that the spire was being constructed. Well, I don't know how everyone's taste for church calling is, but you can see it's a wellspring of historical information, and when we're getting back as far as 1,000 years, this feels like good stuff to know. So we have a Saxon church with later Norman additions, definitely worth a visit, but is that all there is in Bosham? Well, to understand the significance of both Bosham and the area around, we need to go back even further, in fact, almost 1,000 years before the church was here, back to the arrival of the Romans. Now, while the main beats of the Roman invasion of Britain are quite familiar, so Caesar makes a couple of landings, one in 55 BC where he only stayed for a few days, and then again the following year for a little bit longer. Even without staying and attempting to subdue the entire island, the Romans would continue to have a major impact on Britain. In fact, even before Caesar had landed, events on the continent had already been shaping life on the island. So when it comes to 43 AD and the Emperor Claudius was in a weak position, he appears to need a PR boost, and the prestige of emulating or even surpassing the deeds of Caesar motivated a full-scale invasion of Britain. Now, the results of the Roman invasion of Britain and the over 350 years they'd be in power are well known, which makes it perhaps surprising that the details of their arrival in 43 AD are a little uncertain. Our sources for the invasion are either a little brief, a little late, or both. This is Richborough. It's a sizable Roman fort that has survived surprisingly well, and about here, this is where pretty much all the history books will tell you the initial AD 43 landings took place. To clear up any confusion, the coastline along the waterway called the Wantsum Channel used to extend much further inland compared to the current 21st century coastline. Now, our main source, Cassius Dio, doesn't explicitly say the Romans first landed here. You can see this puzzling structure at the centre of the fort. These are the foundations of a now long-vanished triumphal arch that was built here to commemorate the Roman conquest of Britain. However, note, that's still distinct from explicitly saying this is where we first set foot in Britain. There is a fair chance that Claudius and his additional forces landed here. We do know that Claudius would later stage a triumph through Camulodunum, now Colchester. However, regards AD 43, an intriguing possibility remains. Cutting back from the Isle of Thanet and almost exactly 100 miles away back to Bosham, Between what are now Chichester and Portsmouth are a series of low-lying shorelines with marshes, creeks and inlets forming several peninsulas and small islands. It's a rather indecisive coastline that can scarce decide where the sea should end or land begin, and it not only fluctuates with the tides, but would have been significantly more wild and untamed 2,000 years ago. But relevant to our story in specific, we have good reason to believe that this coastline, somewhere, may have been the first entry point of the Romans into Britain in AD 43. Now, in the absence of firm evidence, I don't want to make an argument from silence, so we are dealing in the realm of the possible and the hypothetical, but it is a good line of inquiry for several reasons. I am drawing from Bloodlines by Miles Russell, which is often confrontational in its arguments, but it asks a lot of questions about the established facts, in parenthetic capitals there, about the Roman conquest of Britain, and particularly shows that the basis for these is often far less concrete than the public might expect. So the account of Caesar's disputed landing in Kent still resonates with modern audiences today. So to Claudius and his retinue drawing up plans for entering Britain, at the very least, Caesar's first landing could scarcely be more of a cautionary tale. A disputed landing with the hostile forces waiting up there on the cliffs, ships lost. It's not hard to imagine that any meeting to discuss the subject around AD 43 would have begun with the universal agreement, let's make sure that that doesn't happen. But beyond just pure geography, there's an even greater reason to land in Sussex. This is the northernmost extent of Chichester Harbour. It's the opposite side of the headland that now has Bosham to the west. In antiquity, we know the water extended a little further up, as far as Fishbourne Roman Palace. Now, with Britain secure, the palace would go on to be one of the most lavish vanity projects in the new province. Arguably a bit of a white elephant, but predating its more grand phases, and you'll see what a big deal this is, this appears to be a Roman headquarters. I mean, quite possibly with a Roman military presence before the invasion of AD 43. This being the case, while it's nowhere near large enough to accommodate an entire legion, it both shows the level to which client kings in Britain were integrated into the Roman system and the degree of loyalty afforded Rome if there are in fact Roman boots on the ground. Now, Dio doesn't give us a location or in fact a clear indication of how many troops initially landed with the general Plautius, who was the first to land. If we take the one legion we know for certain were involved in the early Britain campaign, the Second Legion, could you land here with something like 5,500 troops? Yeah, potentially. I hope it goes without saying, but this coastline would not have been identical to how it appears now. More to the point, and while this requires going over the sources and their subsequent translation with a fine-tooth comb, there are some reasonable grounds to believe that the people named as the Boduni by Dio may be what we're in the habit of calling the Dobuni, centred around the Bristol Channel and Cirencester. It comes down to whether or not you accept that Boduni and Dobuni are cognates. Now, with that in mind, the orthodox sequence of events drawn from Dio suggests that the Roman army landed in Kent, took a march all the way to the Cotswolds, then marched all the way back to the south of the Thames, just to have a disputed crossing at the Medway while heading north. You can see the potential points of arguments against some of the details of this, but it does make a curious strategy to perform a huge march all the way almost to the Severn and then all the way back again. In fact, this really only makes sense with the route close to what Miles Russell suggests in Bloodlines. You'll have to get yourself a copy and go over the various details yourself. I can't cover every point here. But pulling all these threads together, Claudius is doing this as a comparatively weak emperor to try, by way of a stunt, to prove that he can surpass Caesar. But Caesar's own experience demonstrates that landing in Kent has considerable risk. And on the other hand, we have a series of nice, natural harbours in Sussex stretching to the Solent, and even if small, an established beachhead where a welcome is near guaranteed. Look, ask any military historian, when it comes to an amphibious landing, the greatest risk is the landing itself. Once you are ashore safely and you've got some defences in place, you've got your supplies, beached your ships, etc., your chances of success multiply tenfold. So we are yet to have any firm evidence of a Roman force landing near Bosham. The possible sites mooted actually extend all the way from Southampton to Southend, so it's a large area. And it's entirely possible that the force was split, with a legion landing in the much more friendly Sussex to hedge against a catastrophic failure in landing in Kent. At the very least, to my knowledge, no one is trying to argue that the Roman landings in the south were not ultimately a success, and nowhere is that more evident than at Fishbourne. In place of the warehouse that had stood there, the site was transformed in its first phase to a villa, then a four-sided complex, which we generally describe as a palace, because villa is simply too much of an understatement for what was built there. Nowadays, what you see at Fishbourne is mostly the northern range, famous for its mosaics. This seahorse from the Cupid mosaic is particularly memorable and has become something of a logo for the palace. We are still not clear on who lived here, the most likely candidate being Toggydumnus or Coggydumnus, or all manner of spelling variations, who is held up as an example of a client king submitting to Rome and being rewarded with this lavish property built in a Roman style and, as not a few have noted, almost wholly unsuitable for the British climate. While Fishbourne is unique amongst the structures we know of in Britain at this time, it's far from the only Roman site in the area. Circling back to Bosham a moment, there's no Roman masonry to see in the village today, but a notable find. In the 1700s, a huge marble head was found near to the church. It sat in the parsonage garden for a while. It's now in the Novium Museum in Chichester. It's pretty massive, but also pretty weathered, making precise identification difficult. A laser scan in 2013 by Miles Russell and Bournemouth University suggested it was of the Emperor Trajan. Now, earlier, we mentioned the theory that the church was built over the site of a Roman basilica. The surveys done have no evidence of that on the site, suggesting the Roman material may have been transported from nearby. A villa was discovered to the north at Broadbridge, that's the area around where Bosham train station is now. Material may have been taken from there, such as the Roman material in the walls, or Fishbourne is another obvious candidate, and Fishbourne sits just under a kilometre from Chichester. Now, Chichester would of course grow into a major civitas or regional Roman capital, but it wasn't an ex nihilo construction by the Romans. These are banks dug to delineate the edge of the oppidum that stood on the site of what is now Chichester. A regional oppidum of the sort we have at Chichester is not the sort of settlement you probably picture from ancient times, but rather than unpacking all of that here, if you want to see more on Iron Age, that's pre-Roman Sussex, we just recently released 2 episodes on our channel over at Forest Archaic Collective. The videos will be linked in the top right, but we're also midway through a series where we explore hill forts all through Britain, so maybe give that a watch after this. So as they did in many other places like Colchester and Silchester, the Romans took over the oppidum and turned it into a power centre which gradually filled up with distinctively Roman urban features such as baths and an amphitheatre which is very hard to film now. This painting gives you an idea of the civitas. However, if you know Chichester at all, you may notice that something is missing. The Roman walls of Chichester as they stand nowadays have had many revamps and rebuilds since the original Roman construction. So while they follow the line and the circuit can still be seen and walked around much of the modern town, they are no longer of the original Roman stone. For that, we need to head a short way down the coast in the other direction. This is Portchester Castle, and it vies with Fishbourne as one of the most significant surviving Roman sites in Britain. Now, while people are understandably distracted by the imposing Norman keep in the northwest corner, you can miss that the rest of the square circuit of walls is not medieval at all, but is in fact one of the best preserved Roman forts north of the Alps. While it is interrupted by medieval work in parts, even an untrained eye can spot the many places where the stonework has been patched up with work that is clearly different, but this is still a fine example of what a Roman fortifying wall looks like, and this is undoubtedly how the Chichester walls would have originally looked. While Portchester's walls are augmented with these projecting towers at various intervals, the bastions around the Chichester walls were a later upgrade. It all points towards a greater period of uncertainty and threat to the southern coast of Roman Britain from the 200s onwards. There's a lot to unpack here, not only the 3rd century crisis, which was in fact a set of crises, including but not limited to the Gallic Empire, where Gaul, Iberia and Britain temporarily became separated from the main territory of Rome. There were also later attempts by Roman generals based in Britain who would be declared emperor. Constantine was one of the most successful examples of this, and after he was proclaimed emperor in Eboracum, now York, he had to fight a bloody and protracted civil war. And others would follow, but these fortifications are not just indicative of rebellious elements in Roman Britain. There is a frustratingly oblique reference in the Antonine itinerary to the Saxon shore. It's in this list of forts beginning at Porchester, and forming a defensive arc around southeastern Britain and up into East Anglia. What we have been unable to conclusively prove either way is the Saxon shore the shore where we defend against the Saxons, or is it the Saxon shore because the Saxons are there and living and trading, etc.? When I first caught up on this channel years ago, Alex was talking about the likelihood of German foederati, or mercenary troops in Britain, being in increasingly senior positions in the army, and thus best placed to be in positions of power when the legions are drawn out of Britain to defend Rome's core territory in the 400s. It goes against the traditional view of Saxons being entirely outsiders getting on boats and raiding in, rather than being already present. Now, whatever the nature of the presence of Saxons and others like the Frisians in these waters, it is clear from the flurry of fortifications being built, the channel is much less safe than it had formerly been. In 280 AD, the northern range of Fishbourne burned, and while it may have been an accident, a site like the palace at Fishbourne was also unquestionably a soft target, this close to the coast and undefended. Against this backdrop, we enter a period of British history where we have a lot of questions and few answers. As the legions left, Fishbourne and other sites like it would crumble and decay, much of their stone being robbed for other uses. Though Fishbourne itself had been such a lavish money pit of a project to begin with, it had already been in decline for a long time before the 400s. Strong walled locations such as Porchester and Chichester would mark them out as major defensive locations. We know that they survived because, well, here they are, though the lives of the people living there in these turbulent transitional centuries are also difficult to categorise. Circling back to Bosham, it does in fact get a mention in one of our earliest written sources. Bede mentions an Irish monk called Dicul having a small monastery at Bossenham, a spot surrounded by woods and sea with 5 to 6 brethren, though he notes rather snippily that the nearby population didn't appear to be too interested in their message. When our sources for Bosham pick up again, we are now in the twilight of the Saxon period, and Bosham was to become the power centre for a particularly powerful family who had come to shape the destiny of England in the 1000s. The Godwins, of whom Harold Godwinson, the last Saxon king of England, is by far the most famous, were also significant power brokers during the reign of Edward the Confessor. Before we get to Harold, there is an intriguing mystery that's yet to be solved at Bosham, a feature we didn't mention at the church, which might have had some of you shouting at your screens. This stone placed here commemorates the possible burial place of Canut's daughter. Canute was a Danish king who ruled England from 1016 to 1035, during which time he would also become the monarch of Denmark and Norway, ruling over a hugely powerful, if short-lived, North Sea empire. Now, there is a tradition that Canute's daughter drowned in a mill stream nearby and was buried at Bosham. Without going into all the ins and outs of this, it's a bit of a mess. In 1865, the church floor was being lowered, and the vicar, Henry Mitchell, did uncover a small stone coffin just in front of the chancel arch. It was said to contain the remains of a child, and this was pronounced to be undoubtedly of an 11th century date. However, in 1954, when some floor repairs were being conducted, the coffin was reopened and contained nothing, except, curiously, a bottle from the 1800s. Now, we have not found any evidence that Canute specifically had a residence at Bosham, but there has been a rather exciting recent discovery. Published at the beginning of this year, results of a 2006 archaeological investigation of Bosham were reassessed. If you recall the Bayeux a moment, getting the spot on the Bayeux tapestry is quite a claim to fame. Am I right, Dinan? Now, much like Dinan, it's difficult to marry the image of Bosham on the Bayeux. By the way, at this point, I have to interject with a classic gotcha, because the Bayeux tapestry, not technically a tapestry, it's technically an embroidery. So next time you want to kill the conversation at an otherwise convivial dinner party, feel free to bring that up unprompted. But yes, while the architecture featured on it may be more stylised than literal, the fact that it's there at all on one of our most extraordinary surviving pieces of medieval imagery. We have Harold riding to Bosham, and the church is depicted, but that's not all. In the next panel, you see Harold and his companions drinking in a significant Romanesque hall. Now, Bosham today has no grand medieval hall. There was a manor in Bosham that was sadly demolished in the 1840s. However, when archaeology was done in the garden of the current structure that stands there, this is to the north of the church, it's a private residence, so I won't be pointing my lens down their garden anytime soon, but the 2006 excavations did locate a rubbish pit, 2 enclosure ditches dated to the Anglo-Norman period, and at the end of a timber building dated to late Saxon, they found a latrine. For the avoidance of doubt, yes, that is a toilet. Well, do they know it's Christmas? Now, this is a serious channel that does serious history, so I won't put some sort of cheap joke or meme here. Okay, I realise this might all sound like a gotcha at all of your expense, but the find of a latrine is actually highly significant, though we would not recognise this until some later work. In fact, I better quote the paper here as to not garble the details. The importance of this latter feature could not be fully recognised at the time, as it is only subsequent publications, first by Gabor Thomas in 2010 and then John Blair in 2015, that convincingly illustrate how latrines came to be linked to the chamber ends of 10th century and later high-status houses. In this light, it is overwhelmingly likely that the late Saxon latrine underlying the timber building at Bosham was appended to a long range, in the same way confirming the manor house as the site of a pre-conquest elite residence. So there you go. We have conclusive evidence of a pre-conquest hall at Bosham that may well be the hall of the Godwins pictured on the Bayeux. Just an aside here, this is one beautiful example of how archaeology is always a collaborative work, and something I keep hearing, whether it's in conversations with Alex or similarly in passing from Miles and others, while it's fantastic to have archaeologists to put trowels in the ground, what the field really lacks is people working on the materials unearthed by previous digs, interpreting finds, cataloguing, writing papers. That's where there's a real gap. Now, less substantively than this recent discovery, there has also been suggestion that Harold Godwinson may be buried at Bosham. Now, if you visit Waltham Abbey in Essex, you can see the memorial marking the place where he was traditionally believed to be buried underneath what was then the High Altar. The 1954 repairs at Bosham, as well as uncovering the small stone coffin and what I'd believed to be Knut's daughter, also uncovered a more elaborate coffin containing some bones. Now, John Pollock, who lives in Bosham, put forward a theory that Harold was buried in Bosham in that larger coffin. A proposal was put forward to the Chichester Diocese in 2004 to re-exhume this coffin, but the diocese refused on the grounds that the threshold for exceptional grounds had not been met. And comparing the two coffins to other medieval coffins from around the country, it now seems much more likely that they're from the 11 or 1200s in date. So that's Bosham. Obviously, I've used it as a jumping off point to discuss some of the other history in the area, but for a small village, there's a surprising amount of history highly significant to the British Isles, and this was a fun story to tell. Otherwise, it was very exciting to have this guest episode with Alex. Definitely going to be working on more things together in the future, but if you want to see more from Saxon England, what better channel could you possibly ask for? Alex has numerous episodes on the Saxon rulers, and I've learned a huge amount I never knew, not least about the nuance of early medieval Northumbria, which is otherwise something outside of my wheelhouse, so definitely queue up some of those. And one day, when I filmed as close to the entirety of Roman and Saxon sites around the UK as we can manage, we'll do a full series exploring the whole lot, though it's going to be a while before we've cleared out our backlog of Norman sites, and ruined abbeys, and Neolithic sites, and Mycenaean sites, and Al-Andalusian sites, and Eastern Rome. Yeah, look, it's a lot. For now, we're getting around as many hill forts as we can. At time of writing, we've just finished the Sussex episodes and the South Downs, so why not have a look at those next? Otherwise, we'll look forward to catching you on another episode. See you soon.
So, I trust you enjoyed that, and if you want to see some more history episodes from Forest Archaic Collective, you can go to their channel, which is linked below. I can especially suggest their series on hill forts, because as you know, I'm passionate about hill forts, and I think they've done an amazing job on it. Just to say as well, if you're interested in late Saxon kings like Harold and Knut, we have an episode on Knut coming out on this channel soon. So make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell, which I really hate saying, but it's really important when you want to watch history channels, because right now we're not getting suggested half as much as YouTube should, and so when you hit the bell, you actually do get notifications when we put out content, so please do that. Otherwise, I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. I look forward to chatting to you down in the comments, and thank you so much for watching.